Retired labor lawyer, professor, New York Times bestselling author, and historian of social movements, Linda Hirshman is out with a new book, The Color of Abolition: How a Printer, a Prophet, and a Contessa Moved a Nation. Linda joins me coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
Welcome, Linda. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. I want to first just say congratulations on the new book. Just incredible reviews about this book about slavery, the abolition of slavery. And when I think about this book and its subject matter, I know you've written about women in law school, the struggle for gay rights, the sexual harassment movement, even Supreme Court Justices Sandra Day O'Connor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So why now a book about the abolition movement?
I always wanted to write about abolition because I write about social movement. So abolitionism is the most successful social movement in American history. If you date the beginning from the publication of the first issue of William Lloyd Garrison's abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, there were trickles of movement before that, but that's a good starting place. It's 32 years to the Emancipation Proclamation. In social movement terms, that is a miracle. So I wanted to write about that miracle. And then I try to get my readers to be interested in the social movements by sweetening them with the stories of the very interesting people who made them. Right. So I had thought I would write about William Lloyd Garrison, the poor white man who became the printer of the abolitionist movement, and Frederick Douglass, the fugitive slave who became the voice of the abolitionist movement. And there, because I was interested in how they forged an interracial relationship, right? How to make an alliance across racial lines, which abolition was. So I thought that would be a great book.
Right. And I know you've been quoted as saying that this movement, this abolition movement, is a critical landmark of moral progress. What do you mean by that when you use the term moral progress?
The battle against slavery was, in the abolitionist movement, a moral battle. It started, as moral matters often do, even though we modern Americans don't like to think it, with religion. So the Second Great Awakening was a Christian revival that immediately preceded abolition. And they called people to be responsible to heal the world, not just to lay back and hope that they were among the elect, like the Calvinists said. They had a social activism element. And that religious morality fed right into abolition. And the second leg of abolition is also moral. It goes back to the Declaration of Independence, which is a moral argument, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights. That is a moral argument. And so if you take abolition off, and then abolition drank from that moral stream, and they watered the landscape of politics with their morality. And I believe that all successful social movements have an element of morality in them.
So I know you just said, Linda, that when you want to entice your readers to get interested in these social movements by focusing on interesting characters. So the three characters that you highlight in this new book, you call a prophet, a printer, and Contessa. Let's start with the prophet. Obviously, that's Frederick Douglass, internationally known abolitionist, civil rights movement. Tell us a little about Frederick that maybe we wouldn't know from history books or what we've been taught in school.
The story I love the best of all the many wonderful stories that Frederick Douglass told himself in the three versions of his memoir is about how he learned to read. So Douglas was assigned to be the companion for a little white boy in a collateral relative of his actual enslavers' family in Baltimore. And these people had never had slaves, so they were not deeply enmeshed in the villainous system themselves. And when the mother of the little boy was teaching him to read his letters, she started to teach Frederick as well.
Wow.
And her husband, Hugh Auld, walked in and said, if you teach that slave to read, he will run away. Stop it at once. And Frederick Douglass, who couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 at the time, learned 2 lessons from that. You got to learn how to read because you're going to run away. You got to learn how to read. You got to run away. And she stopped teaching him, but he went to the docks of Baltimore. He was freer than most enslaved people are, and played with the little white boys who were there. And he observed the signs on I love this so much. He observed the signs on the boxes and on the ships and stuff, and he figured out what they must mean. And then he reverse engineered it to teach himself how to finish teaching himself how to read and how to write. I mean, just think about that, right? The determination and the brilliance. And words were his element. He used them first in his speeches, and then after he got a printing press, he had his own newspaper, the North Star, and then Frederick Douglass's paper. He used them in his narrative, which was one of the best-selling books of the 19th century. So words were his weapon, and he got them by teaching himself how to read.
What period is this book set in? Help us understand the period that you're talking about, this prophet, and then we'll talk about the next character, the printer.
So Frederick Douglass was born, we think, in 1818. He says, of course, nobody ever told an enslaved person when their birthday was. So he took Valentine's, it wasn't bad. He took February 14th for his birthday. We just celebrated it. And he lived in Maryland in slavery until he escaped. He was, I think, not quite 20 in 1838. Mm-hmm. William Lloyd Garrison, the printer, was born in 1805. So he was a little older than Douglass, and the Contessa was Garrison's exact contemporary.
Okay, so William Garrison is a printer, and the story takes place in Boston, right?
It's partly in Boston. It starts in Boston, but after a time in the story, Douglass moves to Rochester, New York, and becomes part of the New York faction of abolition. So it really takes place in 3 places: in Boston, in New York, and in the United Kingdom.
Right. Let's go back to now our Contessa, Maria Weston Chapman. Not a very well-known figure, either in the civil rights movement, the abolitionist movement. Why her? Why did you select her to be one of the characters in your book?
So I stumbled across her, right? I was going to write about Garrison and Douglass. And she shows up in the secondary literature. A feminist scholar, Lee Chambers, wrote a little book about her family, the Weston family. So I was like, oh, a woman. I wonder why she's not been more reported. Because it was clear to me from the little I could glean from the Chambers book that she was really important in the Boston faction, the Garrison faction of the abolitionist movement. And I thought about the male anthropologists who went into the jungle and they recognized the chimpanzees, but they never actually recognized the bonobo because the bonobo did not behave like male anthropologists. And I thought, historians have looked at this period and they missed the woman. It is, in fact, the case that she was not a speaker. She was not one of the women that broke up the abolitionist movement over the issue of women's place. So she was more of a behind-the-scenes actor, but she was a writer. She published a very important newsletter. She wrote hymns. She wrote a very valuable book about abolition. She left a track record. So it was not hard to find it, but of course I was ecstatic, as you can imagine, right? to find someone who the other people had missed.
Yes, and who the men who mostly tell the history had decided that she wasn't significant enough to be included in the history.
It is incredibly bizarre because she was unbelievably important. She was like the little girl with the little curl in the middle of her forehead. When she was good, she was invaluable to the abolitionist movement. And when she was bad, she was part of a circle of upper-class white Bostonians who never really could quite rid themselves of their racist beliefs.
Yeah, we'll talk about her in detail in terms of how she, in some ways, disrupted this very powerful movement that was happening in Boston. But I'm curious about, were you able to determine how they met, the three of them? How did they come together?
I do know how they met. Douglas had been in the North for a couple years, and the people from the Underground Railroad had settled him in New Bedford, where the people sort of looked out for the Black people among them and tried to watch for the slave catchers, so they were more protected there. And when he was in New Bedford, remember, he was already literate, and he was already starting to tell his story at the Little Black Church in New Bedford. And a white Quaker, I think he was a Quaker Coffin, abolitionist, heard Douglas speak in his little church, and he recognized his genius, and he said, "You have to come with me to Nantucket." So in the summer of 1841, 3 years after Douglas escaped, his sponsor took him to Nantucket, where there was a meeting of the New England Anti-Slavery Society. And his sponsor said to him in the meeting, "Tell your story, Frederick, tell us your story." And he stood up in front of this sea of white people. And I mean, just think about it. He says in his own writing, Douglas, he says, "I was afraid all the time because I could be recaptured at any moment and sent back into slavery." He's looking out at a sea of white faces, and he's going to make himself visible. And he stood up and began to tell his story. And as one reporter described it later, no heart was left unturned by his story. William Lloyd Garrison, who was running the show at that point, was in the audience, and he stood up to speak after Frederick finished. And right after Douglas finished, and Garrison stands up and says, "Is this a man or is this a thing?" And the room chorused, "A man, a man." And he said, "And should he be held in chattel slavery like a thing?" No, no. That was the moment when Garrison and Douglas met. Garrison already knew Maria Weston Chapman, who had come into the anti-slavery movement many years before Douglas. So there was a Garrison helped found a Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society, thinking that women could help abolition as they had helped the British movement. So Maria marries into an abolitionist family. Her sisters and her cousins tell her about the Anti-Slavery Society. She gets all dressed up. She was absolutely gorgeous and very wealthy and gorgeously dressed at all times. Mm-hmm. And she sashays into the New England Anti-Slavery Society meeting. And the modest activists in the meeting thought she was a spy. So different did she seem from them. But she immediately involved herself in their activities, and she met Garrison because the Boston movement was one small clique. So when did Maria meet Frederick Douglass? We don't actually know that because the New England Anti-Slavery Society hired him on the spot in Nantucket to be a lecturer for them, and they organized to send him out. And Maria Weston Chapman was the manager at that point. She was essentially managing the speaking tour. Mm-hmm. And so at some point, they obviously came into contact. The first evidence that we have is through their letters.
Yeah. So let's talk about Maria. As you said, upper, affluent family in Boston, a part of the upper class. in Boston society. Here she is working with this African-American freed slave, recently freed slave, and this printer. And she's very involved in the movement. She's organizing speaking events. She's writing this newsletter. She's the manager, as you will, of this abolition movement that's happening in Boston. But she's not unlike some of the white people that we see during this period. Even though she's helping move this agenda of freeing the slaves, she's also very much steeped in the ideology of slave owners. Help us understand that duplicity in Maria.
You know, I think you have to make a distinction between enslavement and racism. So she was not steeped in the ideology of enslavement. She did not think that people should own other human beings. That was the gift and the blessing of the abolitionist movement. No matter what their position was about racial equality, they had a touchstone, which was it was immoral and a violation of American political principles to own other human beings.
Well, then, is that a real distinction? If people think that Black people are subhuman and they think they are inferior, are we giving them too much credit to say that there's some huge distinction between them and Southern whites who own slaves?
I think we need to give them credit for their battle, and in Garrison's case, lifelong battle against enslavement. Enslavement was such a ghastly, terrible, cruel, and awful institution that, and I don't think they thought they were subhuman, although the enslavers have an ideology that Black people are genetically not human beings. I don't think that the racism that I saw in the movement, which was shocking and terrible to see, by the way, even in abolitionists, right? But I think that it's a weird thing to say now, but I think they were suspicious that Black people were inferior, but not that they were so inferior as to not be human. And maybe I'm making too fine a distinction because the things they said were terrible. But very familiar in her.
Yeah, when I look at how you write about Maria and how she turns when there is this split between Garrison and Weston with Douglass and how she lashes out at him,
right?
It has so much familiarity with what we see from white supremacists today and white nationalists. So I'm having a hard time putting her in a distinct category.
But I think it's more interesting to think about the abolitionists as a very mixed blessing. So I say, can you have an interracial alliance? And then when Maria comes along, I say, can you have an interclass alliance, right? And my answer is yes and no. So I think regarding it as a matter of yes and no is more interesting than the simpler version of it. But I want to be sure you know that she didn't just start when Garrison and Douglass split apart. To my shock, I mean, I'm reading the letters, right, online, right, during the pandemic, and to my shock, this abolitionist hero who gave up all her social status and spent all of her time trying to get abolition going, says the first time that Douglass complains about something, she says, well, they just don't want to work that hard. I mean, that is a shocking thing to read in an abolitionist letter from 2021, let's say, when I was writing the book, or 2020, whatever it was. I was like, shit, that's like the racist stuff that people say now. And so to see it, but I think it makes it so important how they managed to work together. Garrison did a better job than Weston Chapman did, but he needed her because she got the bazaars organized so that they would raise a bunch of money. Her bazaars basically paid the bills for the Boston abolitionist movement. And I think it's fair to say that in 1860, Lincoln thought that they would never have gotten where they were without the moral wing of Garrisonian abolition. She was paying the bills with the bazaars she ran. You can't discount her for that. And yet, at the end of the day, they could not remain allies because Frederick Douglass, of all people, would know when he was being disrespected. And at some point, when he got enough power to be independent, he ran away from them, just like he ran away from Maryland.
Yeah, I don't think we discount her, and I'm happy that you have brought her forward because she is a part of our history that's often hidden, that's dismissed, that's distorted. And in this moment where people are trying to distort and dismiss our history, I applaud people like you who keep bringing it forward because we definitely don't want to hide it. We need to talk about it. We need to understand it. I don't see her in the same vein as many historians who write about white liberals today, Linda, who are in many ways more harmful than not to these movements for social justice. And it's interesting to see some of the parallels with her and some of the critique of white liberals today. Did you make any connections between that movement and what we're seeing today?
Impossible not to. And one of the reasons why I was interested in an interracial and interclass alliance is that slavery could never have been abolished without that alliance. You cannot expect people in enslavement in Mississippi to end slavery. It's so wrong to expect. So there had to be one. And I feel that there has to be one now. So I was interested in looking at, could it be, and how hard is it, and where does the difficulty come from? And what I think is really interesting is after the Boston wing drove Douglass out, he had many, at that point, the Black conference movement and the Black movement part of abolition had really gotten a lot of traction after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. The Black movement became much more militant and much more visible. There were free Black people, right? And they were his community. So I don't want to discount that. But he made an alliance with another white person, Gerrit Smith, the son of the partner of John Jacob Astor, the richest man in 19th century America. And Gerrit Smith did some things that I think are really a lesson for today's liberals, okay? One of them was he bought land in New York and he divided it up and he gave a little piece of land to each of the Black activists in the movement so that they would have enough land to qualify to vote in New York State. Okay, that's a weird kind of reparations, and it was brilliant because it actually had, right, this white guy could use his money to do something that was really meaningful for the equality of Black people, right? Brilliant. And it reflects Gerrit Smith's real freedom from the kind of substrate of racial assumptions that you see in the Boston branch. When Douglass was attacked, as he was often attacked, when Douglass would appear in public with any white person, they would attack Douglass. So Douglass was attacked, and Gerrit Smith writes him a letter, one of the million letters I read during the pandemic for the book. And Smith says, I feel for your humanity, right? And that was like perfectly understanding Douglass. Mm-hmm. Douglass was always about being a man. And Gerrit Smith knew that. So it is possible to have an interracial alliance. But you have to say out loud, and I said it out loud. I asked a lot of people before I published this book with the letters with the N-word in them, right? You have to say out loud what these people were saying to each other behind the back of, wait for it, the most important man in the 19th century America, Frederick Douglass. The things that they were saying about him need to be put out so that we can say, look, this is what we're dealing with. Yeah. And we're going to have to work really hard to be a Gerrit Smith and not an Edmund.
Yeah, I think it's a great juxtaposition how Gerrit Smith recognized the humanity of Frederick Douglass and recognized that in that moment, what African-American people needed was the opportunity to assert their agency, their sovereignty And by having that land, they were able to do that. Whereas Maria Weston Chapman, the way she's described often as Lady Macbeth, but as this domineering figure, even over Garrison, and wanted to dominate Frederick Douglass. So it was either they submit to her way, which was this non-political, non-violent, non-resistance way of pursuing the abolition movement, or else if they didn't submit to her every whim, then she went berserk, let's call it that in colloquial terms, and berated him using familiar racial tropes, called him lazy, shiftless, used the N-word. So she, I don't know, as a person, I don't like her, Linda. Sorry.
She was a bossy woman. And we are uncomfortable.
Is she a Karen? I don't know. As I'm reading about her, I'm like, okay, she's like a modern day Karen.
I don't think so. I think it's much more destructive than that, because Karen is an open adversary. And she really was devoted to, she was a moralist. She regarded herself as superior, morally superior to everyone else. And whatever position she took, that was the only right position.
Yes.
She got the non-resistance and the non-political piece of it from Garrison. Those are Garrison's beliefs. But throughout her life, Maria it was so wonderful. She was running an abolitionist meeting in Boston early on, and there was a white mob outside banging on the doors and throwing stones and stuff, and the mayor of Boston came in and said, "You gotta go." And she turned to the mayor of Boston and said, "I asked you to protect us." So that was her attitude toward everyone, and she delivered it in a, shall we say, non-discriminatorily about everybody who differed with her. I think there's something a little different about the contrast. It's Garrison is saying, like, we will not dirty our hands with politics. We will not resist with increasing degrees of force, as the Black movement increasingly did after the Fugitive Slave Act. We will not do this. Douglass, who started out a Garrisonian, moved to political activism, and although he didn't go with John Brown, he certainly was harboring John Brown right before he left to go to Harper's Ferry. So I've asked myself for the 5 years I've been working on this book, what was different? And I think that has relevance to the present, which is what you're asking me about. Douglass, as a fugitive slave, could not care about anything more than abolition. Mm-hmm. He could not. He said, "I will go anywhere where free speech is allowed and this poisonous system of slavery can be abolished." Mm-hmm. He did not have the luxury of indulging himself in Garrison's moral purity, or Edmund Quincy's casual class-based racism, or Maria Weston Chapman's egomania. He didn't have the luxury. He had to get slavery stopped. And I often think, since it was just his birthday, that slavery might have lasted a lot longer if it hadn't been for Frederick Douglass. He was a miracle.
Yeah, and the book shows that Frederick Douglass's approach ended up being the right approach, because it is Frederick Douglass who has the ultimate relationship with Abraham Lincoln, a political figure. So using his political acumen and close ties to politics, he was able to influence Abraham Lincoln in a way that the Garrisonians would have never been able to do.
That is correct. He would never have gotten into the White House. When he was, the first time he went to the White House, he went on his own because he wanted to tell Lincoln that Lincoln had to stop paying the Black troops who were dying for the Union half the pay of the white troops. So how am I going to get in, says this Black man who had been in slavery 30 years before. And he called in his chits from his political contacts that he had developed in the years that he was on the political side of abolition. So even though it was wrong, but I think importantly wrong, we need to understand how hard it is to maintain an alliance across racial lines. And it was wrong what Maria Weston Chapman and ultimately William Lloyd Garrison and Edmund Quincy did. It was wrong. But it had the benefit of alienating Douglas, who then went over to the political side of abolition, and that was the right move. That was the moment when all the seed work that the moral branch had done began to produce little political parties and an occasional representative in Congress. And it gave rise to a political movement. And at that point, to say, well, I'm too good for politics, I'm a white man and don't have that much to lose, was exactly the wrong thing to do. And the New York branch didn't do that. They wanted to get involved in politics. They produced the Republican Party.
Yeah. Who in this period, Linda, were the groups that were fighting the hardest against the abolitionists, whether it was the Boston wing, the apolitical Boston wing, or the political wing that emerged out of Rochester, New York?
At that point, I would say that the Garrison wing had done its job. Okay, they had transitioned from the Second Great Awakening, moral awakening, to the possibility for politics. And let's say starting in 1844, okay, with the Mexican War, which added more slave territory. Okay, that point, the political wing was starting to take off, but they had done an unbelievable job. And right then, the telegraph line was laid from DC to New York so that newspapers all over the country in a New York moment could get the news from Washington about the increasingly loud arguments against slavery. So I would say that Douglas went to the United Kingdom on a book tour, and he was away during the Mexican War. And that while he was there, his English supporters bought him his freedom. So when he came back, he was technically not vulnerable to being recaptured and sent back to slavery in Maryland. So at that point, he started drifting over to the political wing. So it was a beautiful coming together of events. But you cannot forget the Black Convention movement and the increasingly effective Underground Railroad movement and the really important Black voices for forcible resistance, especially after 1850. Because once the slave hunters started coming into the North, there was a reign of terror in Brooklyn, where the Black people in New York, a lot of them lived. Then the Black movement became much more militant, and they played a very, very important role in resistance.
So were the anti-abolitionists as organized or more organized in this moment than the abolitionists?
They were not more organized because they didn't have to be, because the Constitution was a bargain with the devil and a slave document, like William Lloyd Garrison said. And so they had every advantage, which is so much like what we're seeing today. The structure of the Constitution favored the empty rural states of the South, and it favored them by counting their slaves. Right? I mean, as 3/5 of people for purposes of assigning representation in the House of Representatives. So the white Southerners not only had their own votes, they they did not actually allow their slaves to vote for the House of Representatives. So they cast 3/5 of a vote for each of the enslaved people that they held. So they had a disproportionate representation. Also, the Senate, which is 2 senators per state, means that as long as you keep insisting that no state can come in free unless a state comes in slave, that you're always going to maintain a balance, as we have now in the United States Senate. And because you dominate the House of Representatives and the Senate, you dominate the Electoral College, and you pick the president, and the president picks the Supreme Court of the United States. So that by the time the Supreme Court decided Dred Scott in 1857, they were overwhelmingly justices who held slaves or had held slaves in the past. So the Southerners did not have to be as well organized as the abolitionists because they had every advantage. Also, the economy of the United States rested heavily on the value of enslaved grown cotton. So it was the cotton empire. It was half the American exports. It drove the textile mills of New England. It was financed by New York banks. The ships that took the cotton to Europe left from the deep harbor of New York. So both Boston and New York financial institutions were completely dependent upon enslaved grown cotton. So they didn't have to be as good, which is good because they weren't as good.
So, Linda, you write this book in this really interesting period, or it's coming out in this really interesting period, this period where there's an effort afoot across states to stop kids from learning about Black history, about true American history. Some of these bills that have been passed are about preventing white kids from feeling uncomfortable about slavery, learning about their ancestors and the fact that their ancestors may have been slave owners. What do you think about this moment we're in, and how does your book fit into this moment?
So I think this moment is a lot like the period that I write about in my book. My friends know that I call myself Cassandra because for a long time I have seen things that other people don't see. So this was not an accident. Okay, I saw the right-wing revival in America starting in the 1950s, and I have seen it rise. And so I was not surprised that my book was so relevant. I'm actually not even glad that my book is so relevant. I would really rather not be living at the present moment in a time that resembles the run-up to the Civil War. But it is very similar. We are deeply divided. We are ideologically divided. We are divided in our concept of what a good life is like. We are divided on our concept of what kind of common government, political society we want to live in together. So the divide is very similar. It does not have the indigestible rock of enslavement in it. So it is not, nothing is in American history is as bad as enslavement. But the racist component of the current divide is as close as you can get to slavery, and it's pretty bad. So I am not happy that we are there, but not surprised that we are there. You read the letters of abolitionists saying these terrible racist things. It's hardly, you've got to be an idiot not to figure that out. So, but I do believe that the abolitionist movement has lessons to teach us for what to do now. Okay, they faced, when William Lloyd Garrison started the Liberator in 1831, he couldn't pay his newsprint bill. Okay, there was nobody. He tried to start the first anti-slavery society. He wanted 12 apostles, he called them. Only 7 people would sign off in all of America. Okay, so it was a huge uphill battle, huge, and they won it. And I think that progressive forces and people who believe in a multiracial and intergender self-governing republic, we need to learn the lessons of abolition. And they are scribble, scribble, use this media technology that you have, use it every day in every way, keep looking at it and trying to figure out how to make it better. I just talked about the telegraph line. That's not different than the internet. So scribble, scribble. Have weekly meetings so that people don't feel so isolated. And weekly meetings are also a place where new ideas emerge. Do retail politics. We saw Stacey Abrams make that real on the ground in Georgia. The abolitionists who couldn't vote, many of the women couldn't vote. None of the women could vote. The women would go from door to door and knock on the door and find the woman at home and ask her to sign petitions to abolish the slave trade in the nation's capital. And while they had her attention, they preached abolition. It's not different than registering voters. You knock on their door, you sit at their table, and you keep going back. You can't just do it on television.
Yeah, great points, Linda, about how the current day movement can learn from the abolitionists. What about your book how do you help people understand that when someone like you, a historian, writes a book like this, that it's not just trying to fit a particular liberal-leaning ideology, but it is based and rooted in true history, true factual occurrences? Because the right takes things like yours and spin them and say, this is just liberal propaganda that's hurting our kids, that's destroying our kids' self-esteem, that's making little white kids cry and make them feel bad about themselves. How do you tell these stories? Because you're talking about a white woman now who used the N-word, who called a black man lazy. So there may be some right-wing group that says, oh my God, she's distorted Maria. Maria is a beautiful, wonderful woman that dedicated her life to the abolitionist movement, and she's now distorting her reputation. She's maligning poor Maria.
Actually, they did not spring to the defense of Maria, the conservatives, but they sprang to the defense of the white man. Surprise. And so the only, the book has gotten an amazing reception. David Blight, the great biographer of Frederick Douglass, wrote a beautiful thing for the book jacket, and you saw the review in the New York Times. But the Wall Street Journal gave the book to a conservative reviewer, and the only criticism she had of me is that I said that Garrison had said bad things about Frederick Douglass, and how could I say bad things about Garrison? And she went on to do exactly what you just described. She said, it's not true. Garrison didn't do that. And I'm like, wait a minute, I got the archives.
You got the receipts, right?
Receipts, right. I'm like, I'm looking, I have a book of Garrison's collected letters. I have the issues of the Liberator in which he called the woman who helped.
Oh, Linda, they'll say that's all fake news, that those letters aren't legit, that you made it all up. And that's the reality when in this moment, when you spend years collecting this data.
News. Oh, shit. I don't know how to turn my phone off.
Don't worry. Live TV, we're used to it.
Right. I'm sorry. Nobody ever calls me on my landline, so I can't imagine who this is. It's probably someone who wants to sell me insurance. So this is too important to have it interrupted, because this is really important.
Yeah, this is real. This is what happens when folks like you write important books.
I am perfectly fine. If you want to criticize that I'm not a trained historian, my degree is in philosophy, if you want to say that I misinterpreted, but you can't say the letters did not call Douglass Samson and said he was in the lap of a white Delilah, that would be his ally from Great Britain, who cut off his hair. You can't say that editorial did not exist. I have it. So it would be 19th century fake news. So that would mean that we modern liberals went back to 1852 when this appeared, and we falsified the Liberator, and then we collected the copies. I mean, this is insane.
Right.
So, in the pages of the Wall Street Journal, she didn't just say that I didn't balance Maria. I just tried with you to balance Maria's good characteristics and her bad ones. And you can fairly say, I'm too kind to her, or I'm too hard on her. But you can't say the letters didn't say what they said. So, of course, this drives me insane, as you can observe. I think it's a problem. In the abolitionist period, the abolitionists sent abolitionist literature to the South using the United States Postal Service. And the slaveholders went to Andrew Jackson and got his postmaster to order the post offices not to carry the abolitionist literature to the South. It might make the enslavers feel bad.
Yeah.
And they had children's pamphlets, by the way. Some of that literature were children's books to teach children about the wrongness of slavery. So they did that, but it failed, didn't it?
Yeah, and it's going to fail today. Those bills may get some traction temporarily, but the truth always wins out. Thank you so much, Linda. The book is The Color of Abolition: How a Printer, a Prophet, and a Contessa Moved a Nation. It's a fascinating read for history buffs. It's a fascinating read for anyone that's trying to understand what's happening today, lessons that we can learn from the abolitionist movement. Thank you for writing it. Thank you for standing up to those that seek to malign those like you who are just telling the truth. Appreciate you for joining me again this morning, and make sure you pick up a copy of this really fascinating book, The Color of Abolition.
Thank you.
I want to thank my guest, Linda Hirshman, for writing this incredible book, and thanks to all of you for joining me today. I think if you are curious at all about what happened in the lead up to the end of slavery, this is absolutely positively the book you want to pick up. It's the book you want to read. It's the book you want to share with others. These three characters that Linda chronicles in this book are fascinating. The interrelationship between them, the infighting, there's lots of intrigue, there's lots of scandal. If you like that in your book, you'll get all of that in Linda's new book. So make sure you pick it up. Words to live by before I get out. If you want to understand today, you have to search yesterday. And thanks to Linda for spending 5 years searching those letters and correspondence and old newspapers and documents to create this book. And she did the work for us. We don't have to go back. We don't have to go to libraries. We don't have to go on the internet and try to find this material. Linda did it all for us. And because of her search of yesterday, we will have a better understanding of today. All right, y'all, I'm out. Be safe out there. Wear your mask, get your booster shot. And remember, we're all in this together.